and we're looking forward to working with you in the future.
Okay, well, it's been great to talk to everybody.
We very much want to hear from Dr. Hascalovici, who is the Director of Pain Management Department of Neurology, Hackensack University Medical Center. He's also, maybe he'll speak about it, if you know, he has a new method in terms of pain management that can be done virtually, which is maybe absolutely revolutionary. And there's a lot he's going to teach us about in terms of actually the science of pain in Shechita and just the anatomy of what's. So we actually put it all together. He's been a tremendous help. His papers the papers that he's written in terms of really promoting the cause of protecting Shechita. We know, as I mentioned in this interview, the anti-Shechita sentiment is very much rooted in anti-Semitism, and Yimach Shemo, Hitler's first anti-Semitic decrees involved disallowing Shechita. So he's been really, Dr. Hascalovici has been an important advocate, really a hero in this area. So it's my honor to introduce him.
Thank you, Rabbi Ganak, for that introduction. Thank you all for this invitation. I'm extremely humbled and very thankful to be here. Also want to give special thanks to the OU, who were really, from the beginning, very big supporters of this initiative, which is to study the effects of Shechita from a scientific angle. And this isn't something that we chose to do. It's something that the Canadian Jewish community was forced to do. They had to deal with the anti-Shechita movement, as Rabbi Ganak explained. Essentially what happened was, actually, before I get into that, what I'll say is, when we decided that we were going to take a look at the science of Shechita, there were some opposers, some opinions that we shouldn't do this. And the reason for that is because we don't know what the science will show us. But we took a different approach, which was a faithful one. We know that we have an Isser not to do Tsar Balachayim, and we also know that we have a commandment, positive commandment to do Shechita. And so those two can't really contradict each other. So we knew definitively that there had to be an answer in the science, and I'm happy to report that I think we did find it, and that's what I'm going to share today. My name is Jacob Hascalovici. I'm a human neurologist and pain management expert. I don't think in pictures. What you're going to hear today is the product of about 2 years of research and work, which was done by myself and a very big team. The team is too big to name everybody, but one thing I need to say is that this project is an extremely expensive one, and I give a lot of shout out and respect to the Montreal Jewish community that have been pillars really supporting this initiative. So a little bit of background, I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, and so about 2 years ago when I received a phone call from a Canadian number, I thought it was either spam or my university, McGill University, my alma mater, calling for a donation, but to my surprise, it wasn't. It was an individual named Yochanan Herzog, who is not here today. He, for those of you who don't know him, he's really an extraordinary, an extremely humble Jew from Montreal, Canada, but truly a larger-than-life figure. He's deeply involved in matters that affect the Jewish community in Canada, locally in his community. He's a Belzer Chassid, but also for greater Canadian Jewish affairs and also some Jewish matters that have global implications like this project. He does this entirely on a volunteer basis, and he makes it look like this is his full-time job, but in reality, he's also an international business person. He is a fierce and outspoken advocate for the Jewish people, and really never afraid to speak up, push boundaries, and step outside his comfort zone for the sake of his friends, his family, for the community. So really a lot to say about him. And just to meet him is to want to be a part of whatever he's working on, and that's really how or why I'm here today. So a big shout out and hakarat tov to Yochanan Herzog. When I got the phone call about this case, I thought it was out of left field. I'm a human neurologist, not a veterinary neurologist. And so I knew very little about Shechita or the brains of bovines or animals in general. So it felt a little bit off topic. But what Yochanan explained to me was that if you look at the anti-Shechita movement is not something new, but if you look at it historically, the reason that we're able to practice Shechita in places like the United States and Canada is because of the Humane Slaughter Act of 1978, which basically says that for religious purposes, Shechita is allowed. It's not that Shechita is ethical and humane. It's that because we enjoy religious freedom, Shechita is allowed. And what that essentially does is it paints a sort of negative picture. We never have proven definitively that Shechita is painless to an animal and it causes immediate unconsciousness. So we're saying we actually don't have to. And so we're almost admitting that there's a real possibility that this might be a cruel thing to do and something inhumane, but we get to do it anyways because we're religious. And that's probably the reason why the anti-Shechita movement keeps rearing its head up and out, because there hasn't been a definitive answer. And so I think that's really the important part about this research and work that we're doing. There is we need to win this debate on a scientific basis, and there's a lot of people to thank: Rabbi Genack, Mr. Yochanan Herzog, Mr. Gary Turgot, Mr. Gregory Borden, our attorney is Jean-Philippe Grillo, and the list goes on. I cannot mention everybody here, and if I missed anyone's name, I'm sorry. I know I did. I want to jump into the material. So with that, I'll just comment a couple of things on the lecture that we just heard. Number one, if an animal is inverted for Shechita, it's very difficult to look at their eyes roll, actually. Their eyes are completely covered by the neck. The animal's upside down. So eye roll is actually not an easy thing to look at. And loss of posture doesn't correlate with unconsciousness. Loss of posture is a symptom of unconsciousness, which means that you lose consciousness and then you faint. And we see this if you've ever been in shul on Yom Kippur and someone is dehydrated and they go down quickly. That's loss of consciousness. That's loss of posture, which happens after loss of consciousness. So these are things that I think the scientific community doesn't fully understand but needs to. That's, again, part of our process. So I'm going to give some background, if I can. Talk a little bit about some of the aims and methods of some of the research that we've been doing, some of the results, and then I'm going to hopefully have time to show some discoveries, some old manuscripts that we were able to dig up that are close to 100 years old. I've talked a little bit about myself, but there are other very important scientific members of our team. That's Dr. Cheryl Hout, who was one of my teachers at Montefiore, who chose me for the neurology residency at Montefiore. She is an expert in epilepsy. That's an epileptologist who studies brainwaves in humans, not animals, but humans. We have on the left Asher Ben Shimol. He's a master's student at the University of Montreal studying fluid dynamics, and I'll talk a little bit about his work. And then Guy Saint-Jean is a veterinary surgeon from the University of Montreal who has been a veterinarian for over 40 years, and he describes himself as a person who loves cows, and that's a quote from him. So a little bit of background. I think Rabbi Genack mentioned this about anti-Semitism, and I think we can't really have this discussion without mentioning. I read an article from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who described anti-Semitism in scientific terms as a virus where the core is the same, but the outer shell of the virus is mutating And we do see, in fact, that if you look at anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, we know that Jews were demonized for their religion. There's blood libel, for example. In the 19th and 20th century, the virus evolved into, it wasn't the religion, it was the Jew. The Jew is the problem. It's an argument or an anti-Semitism based on race. And what we're seeing today in modern times is primarily through assaults on the legitimacy of the state of Israel, apartheid, genocide, etc., false claims and narratives. And what we see in the anti-Shechita movement, the evolving virus of the anti-Shechita movement, if you look back historically, in the mid-18th century, the claims were that the Jewish religion is cruel because the Jewish religion commands us to do the act. So it's the attack against the religion. And then in the 19th century, it was against the shochtim, the people who are doing the shechita itself, that they're doing it incorrectly and their work is cruel. So it's the Jew who's the problem. And now today what we're seeing is this social justice movement where essentially the same pattern that we're seeing. So I think most people in this room know a lot about shechita, so I won't spend too much time on it. With a very sharp knife, a shochet who's very well trained, uses a surgically sharp knife to sever the great vessels in the neck, the carotid arteries, the jugular veins, the trachea as well, and the sympathetic chain, the autonomic nerves that are in the neck as well. The vagus nerves in the neck of the animal uninterruptedly, so in a single strike, and what we see is the animal immediately loses consciousness, which we'll get into. Slaughter with stunning, which is the method of slaughter that is also in part in the Humane Act of 1978, is stunning essentially is a mechanism to render an animal unconscious before bleeding, which involves shooting the animal in the head or electrocuting the animal's brain, all of which have relatively high failure rates, which means if you do it once, sometimes you have to do it twice or three times, 10, sometimes 20% failure rate. And I can tell you that if you are shot in the head and you don't lose consciousness, that is extremely painful. So in Canada, what happened was we saw the evolution of the anti-Shechita movement virus in a different form. What happened in the Canadian case was the Canadian Food Inspection Agency decided to release new guidelines on the handling of animals in a slaughterhouse. And so what they said was, we have no issue with Shechita. We have no issue with the shochtim. But if you want to practice Shechita, you have to wait for the animal to be brain dead before you can hoist it and shackle the animal and hoist it and process. So what that essentially did was it turned the entire production of Shechita, it slowed it down from, let's say, 60 animals an hour to 5 to 10 animals an hour. Because it could take minutes before an animal goes from unconscious to brain dead. Now, once they're unconscious, they're not feeling pain, and I'll talk about that. What the new guidelines effectively did was they shut down Shechita. And so even though they didn't say it's illegal, and they didn't say that Jews are inhumane and it's cruel and unethical, they just created guidelines that essentially made it impossible for us to continue to produce meat in Canada. And so we went to court. We won an injunction which basically stayed these guidelines, so we don't have to follow them. But the Canadian government is insisting on going to court on the merits. They want to look at the science and they want to review this. They did. They reviewed it. They brought some experts to say that that these guidelines and science make sense. And so it's back and forth. This is an ongoing thing. And again, something that will probably end up being very prolonged in court and very expensive, unfortunately. This is not new, something we found. This is an article from the Canadian Jewish Times. Take a look at the date. Yes, it says 1913. Actually, in 1913, there was a case against a shochet in Canada, in Halifax. His name is Avraham Levitt, Rabbi Avraham Levitt. He was a shochet from Russia who came to Canada to do Shechita and to live there, and he built a community in Halifax, and he was prosecuted for doing Shechita, and he was convicted and charged with a criminal offense, and the Canadian Jewish community riled together and went back to court, filed an appeal, and got him released. And so, again, actually, we didn't know this when we were in court in Canada. I feel like this is like, jurisprudence, right? We've been here, done that, but again, this is just, history repeating itself. So there are some unanswered questions. Number one, does Shechita cause any undue pain to an animal? And how quickly or slowly do animals lose consciousness and therefore the ability to perceive pain after Shechita? And is loss of consciousness after Shechita progressive or instantaneous? So these are some of the questions that we had to come up with very intelligent answers for. Let me show you, people ask, why are you commenting? What is the connection between human neurology and veterinary neuroscience? Well, the reality is that most of human science is based on animal research and vice versa, especially when it comes to the human brain. We know a lot about human neurology from animals, specifically the bovine, the cow, and that's because for example, mad cow disease, we know about the human form, CJD, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, prion disease, we know that from the animals, vice versa. So there's a lot of similarities between the human and bovine brain, and you probably can't tell which one is which if it didn't say bovine and human underneath. There are also very important differences, though, in the brains of animals, and this is something that the anti-Shechita movement has tried to capitalize on. The fact that in humans, blood flow comes primarily from the arteries in the front of the neck, but in an animal, in a bovine, there is shared perfusion of the brain, blood flow to the brain from the front and the back of the arteries in the brain of an animal. And there's also some important connections between the front and back circulation of an animal. I want to talk about consciousness because this is something that's often difficult to grasp. Consciousness is our inner voice. It's the way we think, the way we feel, the way we interpret the environment and our experiences, and really both the inside and the outside world. This is what means to be conscious. And what that means is, if we're not conscious, then we cannot experience the inside or outside. So the outside, let's say, is smell and taste and touch. These are our senses of what happens on the outside of our outside world. And so we perceive them. We perceive the taste of a banana or an orange or the sight of a beautiful piece of art. We feel our perception of what happens on the inside of our body is pain. Pain is our perception of what happens on the inside of our body. It's the only indication or symptom that we have that there's something going on inside our body. But what that means is, in order for us to perceive something, we absolutely have to be conscious. We have to be awake. And the best example of this is general anesthesia. What we do is we put a person to sleep so they don't feel pain. We bring their level of consciousness down to the level that they can no longer perceive the inner and outer workings. That's why we can't see, we can't sleep. This is also true in sleep, actually. If you've ever had any back pain, it can be hard to fall asleep, but once you're asleep, right? And why is that? It doesn't mean the pain goes away. It just means that our level of awareness is diminished to the point that we can no longer perceive it. We can measure consciousness using EEG. This is a test where you put these electrodes on the brain, and you can actually look at the way the brain waves are functioning, the activity of the brain, to assess levels of consciousness. And this is a picture of those types of leads. You can put them on humans, you can put them on animals, and so a lot of the animal research on loss of consciousness was done with EEG. There's two types of EEG. On the left, you see scalp, where they put the stickers, electrodes on the skin. And then on the right side, you see ECOG, which is much more sensitive and specific and much better at picking up patterns of loss of consciousness. And there, you require electrodes implanted into the brain itself, kind of like what Elon Musk is trying to do with his company Neuralink, where you put leads or wires in the actual brain, not on the outside. And if you look on the far left of the screen, you see a normal awake EEG. You see these low frequency scribbles. And then in the middle, where you see there's this pattern right in the middle there where things look like they're slower, so they're more waveform. I can't really point here. It doesn't show, but it's right in the center of the green picture where it looks slower. That's an unconscious EEG when someone has lost consciousness. And then on the right side, you're looking at a flat line. That's brain dead. Now, if you look at the research, the literature about Shechita in general, there seems to be a misunderstanding between loss of consciousness and brain death. Those words are used interchangeably, but they are completely different states of being. Unconsciousness versus brain dead, there are a completely different physiology. What's important to know is when you're unconscious, you are insensible to pain. There is absolutely no pain once you are unconscious. The progression from unconsciousness to brain death, which in the video that we just saw from Temple Grandin seems to blur the line, honestly. I think they talk about loss of consciousness and brain death in one sentence. It's just incorrect. They're completely different things, and they should never be meshed together. And I think that's a very important distinction. And so when you're assessing the consciousness of an animal, you should look for markers of loss of consciousness, not markers of brain death, because when the animal first drops or first the cut happens and the blood flow stops to the brain and they're unconscious, they're not brain dead. So their eye will blink. They will kick, and to an untrained observer, this looks bad. It looks bad. But if you understand that the animal is unconscious and therefore insensible, this is just reflexive activity. It's just reflexes and is not a reflection of any kind of pain or suffering from an animal at all whatsoever once the animal is unconscious. That's something that's hard to teach to a person in an abattoir that's not necessarily educated in neuroscience and neurology. The brain is where the cerebral cortex, that's the top part of our brain, that's the neocortex, that's the thing that makes us different from animals, the development of the neocortex. It is responsible for both consciousness and for pain perception. It has to work for us to have pain perception. And the brain requires blood flow at specific pressures with a specific amount of oxygen. And so when you remove the blood flow to the brain no longer has flow, pressure, or oxygen. And what that does is it immediately, the change in pressure, this pressure drop that happens instantaneously, causes the lights off type phenomenon. And we see this in human syncope. I mentioned this. This is the same mechanism. When the blood pressure in the brain drops, that's what happens when a person faints in Shul on Yom Kippur. This is exactly what you're seeing. And I had a video where there's a football player, if you watch football, Damar Hamlin is a football player who got hit in the chest and his heart stopped and he dropped. And you can see it on live television. And this is a very, very fast phenomenon. It doesn't take minutes. It takes seconds, if anything. So what did we do? We had to convince a judge. We have to convince a community of research. What our aims were, number one, we had to build a very strong case, scientific case, the strongest case for scientific case for Shechita to date, based on neurobiology and also physiology. And we hoped to do this by reviewing the existing literature, trying to understand the anti-Shechita arguments, and then, of course, try to explain these discrepancies and try to build new research initiatives with an asterisk. Our goal was to try to do this without harming a single animal. It's very difficult to get funding for animal research in this field where there's a lot of information and literature. And, we don't want to do any tsar balachaim. So we have to figure out a way to prove definitively that this is a humane and ethical form of slaughter that causes instantaneous unconsciousness and no undue pain without harming a single animal. It's not a small task. So what we did was we started to look at the literature. We looked at literature from 1920 to 2025, actually. We looked at over 150 primary sources, more than 10 review articles. We looked at 15 articles that were more than 50 years old, 3 articles that were approximately 100 years old, and about 10 articles that were written in German that we had to have professionally translated into English just so we could understand them and learn from them. We then zeroed in on the modern literature. I'll talk about the old new, we call it, the old new, some of the rediscovered information at the end if we have time, but now what we wanted to focus on is the modern literature. So what we did was we looked at all the literature and we said which studies specifically address the question of time to loss of consciousness after shechita or halal or other forms of non-stun slaughter. And we found 18 articles, 6 which used EEG, remember, the scalp, the one on the skin. We found 5 studies that use ECOG, ones that are implanted in the brain. And then we found 7 studies that were behavior observational studies, where you look at the animal and you watch, like Temple Grandin was saying, loss of posture, et cetera. And so I summarized them here. I'm not going to go through them. These are the EEG studies, but I would point those to the last column. The last column is where you look at the seconds. This is the conclusions about the time it takes for the animal to lose consciousness. And if you look, you see here 4 seconds, 85 seconds, 330. And I'll just show you the ECOG studies, same thing. You see this wide range of numbers. And the behavior studies, even more wide range of numbers. So we had this big task, which is, why are there substantial inconsistencies in the literature? First of all, you have 18 studies. Let's assume they're all correct. Why are they so different? Why do we have such enormous ranges? And 2, if we know and understand the physiology, why are we getting numbers like this? It doesn't make sense. So we came up with a few hypotheses and we tried to test them. And what we found was our observations were, number 1, there are variations in slaughter procedures. So we know shechita and halal, they're similar, but they're not the same. Halal uses a serrated knife. The shochet is, their imam or person who does the slaughtering is trained differently. They use a different knife. It's not long, it's short. So the slaughter procedures are different. And also this non-stun slaughter, which they talk about in the literature, which is not shechita, it's not halal, it's sort of undefined, where they just bleed the animal. We have absolutely no idea what was done. So that could account for some variation. We found inconsistent methodologies and endpoints. If you look at one study using EEG and another study using behavior, you can't really compare those two one-to-one. Some are more specific, some are less specific. And some of them have what we call terminological misunderstandings. Some papers have conclusions based on brain death, but that doesn't actually address the question of loss of consciousness. And so even though they write in their paper, we looked at unconsciousness, the flatline EEG shows 300 seconds. So they're talking about unconsciousness, but they're reporting on brain death, which again is not the same thing. And then finally, we find what we call misleading meta-analysis, where people have taken, the researchers, and this is published in the literature, surprisingly, where they take information from different studies using different endpoints, and they mix it all together, and then they present it as a range. Here's an example from Claudia Turlot, who's a famous animal researcher. Look at her conclusion here. She says, in cattle, the results vary. She's talking about slaughter. Studies on non-stunned calves of different ages found that loss of consciousness or death, so you see what she's doing, mixing up loss of consciousness and death, putting it together, occurred between 5 and 336 seconds following the bleeding, and then she has a bunch of references here. So what we did was, we actually looked at those references. Most people don't. And we started to categorize them. And what we found was, look at the highlighted, that data range comes from studies that looked at EEG, ECOG, not the same thing, and behavior observations, and they're all mixed together. So it's actually not a meta-analysis. It's misleading and it doesn't adhere to the standards of meta-analysis using the PRISMA guidelines, which is an international accepted method of conducting these type of research and studies. Yeah. So now we said, okay, we have a whole bunch of studies. We don't want to do any new research. So how can we reconcile some of the variations beyond these hypotheses using the data that we have available to us? So then we said, well, look, not all science is created equal. Some studies are probably better than others. And so we looked at basic principles of science and research. We said to ourselves, direct evidence is better than indirect evidence, right? If I can measure loss of consciousness, that's much better evidence than watching an animal faint. Because fainting is the symptom of unconsciousness. You faint after you become unconscious. So fainting is indirect evidence. We know that direct is better than indirect. Principle number one. Principle number two, we know objective data is better than subjective data. You can't lie about your blood pressure. You go to the doctor, you say, my blood pressure is normal, and they check it and it's not normal. It's just the doctor's office. You can't lie about those numbers, right? When you ask you, how's your pain? You could say, oh, it's 2. It's only 2 out of 10. There's no way to measure that. That's subjective. So that the objective data is better than subjective data. And we take that as a general principle. High temporal and spatial resolution. With the tests that we have, some are better, more sensitive, like the implanted electrodes, and some are less sensitive, the ones on the scalp of the EEG. So we took that to say that those studies would be better than the others. And then finally, we looked at Shechita, halal, and we said that the slaughter procedures are different. We know Shechita is done by a shochet that's trained for years, and it's a skilled art, and it's something that is, we verify the length of the knife and the sharpness, and so it's a very precise procedure versus the other forms of slaughter that are done in the literature, and so we weighted those articles better. And then we looked back at those studies. And we gave each study a score based on those 4 principles. And what we found, take a look at the top 4, is that the highest quality studies, the ones with direct evidence, the ones that are objective, the ones that use Shechita, the ones that have high temporal and spatial resolution, all consistently show that loss of consciousness happens certainly within 10 seconds. And sometimes even quicker. So we concluded, based on neurobiological principles and the highest quality of data that we have to date, that loss of consciousness following Shechita, when done correctly in a low-stress environment, appears to be extremely rapid and likely occurs in less than 10 seconds. Thank you very much. For the next part of this talk, how much time do we have? Okay. What I want to do is focus on some of the other research that we did, which I think is also equally important, because it's one thing to show, using the existing literature, that we have good answers for some of the hard questions. But there is a very large field of science, the anti-Shechita movement, that does present arguments that could put into question. They create scenarios where these conclusions may or may not be true. And so what the anti-Shechita arguments, we thought it was very important for us to try to explain why these anti-Shechita arguments, to refute them essentially. So what are they? What are the anti-Shechita movements? Well, at the beginning, arguments. So at the beginning I said the blood circulation of a bovine is a little bit different than a human. Humans get a lot of their blood flow from the front of the neck, so do animals, but animals also get about 50% of their blood flow from arteries in the back of the neck, the vertebral arteries. Now, the argument is that if the vertebral arteries are not cut, which they are not in Shechita, that the brain can still get blood flow from the vertebral artery, and the animal will not lose consciousness immediately. It will be a slow and progressive loss because of blood flow to the brain. That's argument number one. Argument number two is, what if the carotid artery, after you do shechita, gets occluded, it gets closed? Then what? Is the animal going to slowly lose consciousness, right? So these are reasonable arguments. So what we had to do was we actually had to figure out what are the hemodynamics, what does the blood flow circulation look like in the brain of an animal under these conditions. And we wanted to do that without harming a single animal. And so what we did was we developed a computational hemodynamic model of the brain bovine cerebrovascular system. This is the first of its kind, and this is not my work. This is work that I'm presenting. This is based on ideas. I need to give myself credit for some ideas, but the actual computational work here is done by Asher Ben Shimol and a research lab at the University of Montreal. And what he did was we mapped the brain of the animal using a pipe system, and we modeled the front, the carotid arteries, those are on the bottom. We modeled the vertebral arteries, those are in the back. You can see that little picture of the brain on the top left and the heart on the bottom right, and we measured the diameter of these vessels, and we put them all into a computer, and we ran simulations. Could you hit, Alex? There's a video. I'm not sure if it's here or not. I'm just going. I'd like to show the video. It's not showing to me. I think you have to click on it. It'll be on this one. No. I hope the video works. If it's not here, then it's here. It's here. Actually, before we get to the video, yeah. So I'll just quickly go, before we get to the video, I'll just show you really quickly. These are the formulas that we used. I don't understand them myself. And we also, not only did we model the blood vessels, but we also looked at the beating of the heart. If you think about flow through a pipe, it's not like a sink because we have a pump that's pumping. So flow happens in beats. And so we were able to calculate that effect on blood flow as well. And here's what we see. Alex, would you mind turning the video on? So what you're going to see on the bottom right is blood particles traveling in the bottom vessel. Actually, I'm just going to come down. That's okay. I think it's important. The bottom, what you're seeing is the heart would be here. So there's blood flow in the carotid artery. And this is where the shechita cut happens. This is a vertebral. This is part of the carotid artery as well, the carotid system. And this is a small pipe back to the vertebral artery. So, play that again. Please. So now that you, would you be able to play that one more time? Thank you. So now that you see what's happening on the top vessel, you see that the vertebral artery actually has very little contribution to shechita, to the brain of an animal, and that circle is what we call the circle of Willis on the top left. That sends blood directly to the brain of an animal. And then you see those red arrows. Now we've created a cut, and now you can see that blood starts to actually flow outside of the brain and out of the opening. So it actually diverts, it bypasses the brain completely, which means that, which basically means that at the time of the cut, the flow goes down to essentially 0 or 1%. So the amount of blood going to the brain of an animal, and that's taking into account the contributions of the vertebral artery. That's where shechita happens. And so what we concluded based about the vertebral artery is that within milliseconds, blood flow to the brain drops by more than 99%, irrespective of contributions of the vertebral artery. That's number one. The next thing that we did was we repeated the model, and what we did was we blocked up to 80% the carotid artery where the cut is. This would mimic a carotid occlusion. and we decided to say, what would the blood flow to the brain look like if we block that artery up to 80%? Would you be able to play this video? And so again here, you'll see a very similar pattern initially, where blood is headed to the left, so towards the brain. And then if you watch the particles on the bottom, once you have the cut, which will appear hopefully in a second, there's the cut. Now you start to see blood headed in the opposite direction, and there's like a dark line over one of the carotids where there's an occlusion. And despite that, we still see essentially zero blood going to the brain of the animal. Yeah, so imagine you close the hole. So if you cut the vessel and then you block it, you're essentially closing the opening. No, so if there's an occlusion, that the pressure in the brain goes back up. So when you start bleeding the animal, pressure in the brain drops dramatically. But if you stop that bleeding, the pressure could theoretically rise. But what the model is actually showing is that even with an 80% occlusion, which means there's 4 surfaces, 4 vessels, the ones that are cut on top, the ones that are cut on bottom, there's actually 8 because there's the carotid arteries and the jugular veins. So you would have to occlude 8 surfaces completely, and the probability of that is essentially 0. And in order for that to happen, a significant amount of time would have passed, which would have allowed so much bleeding to have already occurred that this is essentially an unrealistic situation. It's impossible. Let's leave it at that. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know if we calculated the actual temperature of the animal. So I can look at that. I don't think, I do think that maybe temperature would have an effect on the viscosity of the blood, potentially. But that said, we did calculate standards for blood viscosity in this model. I don't know how temperature would affect blood viscosity, to be honest. That's right. We calculated the viscosity of blood for an animal in this model, not a human. Good questions. And then this is just a visual depiction of the effects that carotid occlusions will have on flow. So you can see the 50, that represents a flow where that's the minimum you need for consciousness to occur, to return, let's say. The minimal level of consciousness is around that 50 flow rate area, and even with 80%, 85% carotid occlusion, you're still only getting a maximum of about 10% blood flow to the brain. So it's essentially impossible for an animal to regain consciousness. And so that was the conclusion, that blood flow through the vertebral artery has no significant impact on cerebral blood flow after severing, and that carotid occlusions have no meaningful impact on the blood flow to the brain of an animal after Shechita. We still have a few more minutes, I hope. Good. Any questions, by the way, before I move on? Yes. Yes.
How is it then that the model showed that it was less than 10% was going that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not that you shouldn't think about it like two sinks that are open. When you think about it, what it really means, it's a good question. What it really means is that the tissue, the brain tissue, so in humans, the carotid arteries, they perfuse the front brain tissue. So there's a separation of the tissue. And the vertebral arteries perfuse the back brain tissue. So the cerebellum, that's the back part of the brain, is perfused by the vertebral arteries, and the carotid arteries perfuse the cortex, the cerebral cortex. In an animal, the front of the brain and the back of the brain share in receiving blood flow from the vertebral arteries and the carotid arteries. So it's not that it's not half-half in terms of flow, it's where the blood is going. They share 50-50, it's equal. Hopefully that clarifies that. I want to talk about the old new studies. This is really, I think, revolutionary. As I mentioned, we found about 15 articles that were more than 50 years old. There were 3 articles that were close to 100 years old. Yes, before I move on. I don't know if the circle of Willis is unique to kosher species. It's a good question. We have it in humans. We have it in bovines. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. There are some. Actually, the answer is probably no, because, for example, sheep, they do not have the similar sheep. If you notice in the literature, they don't talk about the slaughter of sheep being not cruel, and the reason for that is because they don't have this circular structure near the brain, so that there isn't shared perfusion from the front or the back. So it's generally accepted that they lose consciousness more quickly. So I don't think that all species that are kosher have a circle of Willis, but I could be wrong. I have to look that up. And then, I'm sorry? I don't know. It's a good question. And then, sorry, your second half of your question was? I think the opposite. I think the presence of the circle of Willis can actually be protective against loss of consciousness. And the reason for that is because if you block, let's say, one carotid artery in the front of, or actually both carotid arteries in the front of the neck, then the vertebral artery, the circle, will divert blood to the front. So that's actually a protective mechanism that we as humans or animals, I don't want to get into evolution, but it's a protection against the brain blood flow. In humans, for example, you can sometimes see a person who looks perfectly normal, and they have a completely occluded carotid artery from stenosis, from plaque, for example, but they're totally fine, no stroke. The reason for that is because of this circle. But again, the cut of Shechita is proximal to the circle, so it's below the circle, and what it does is it stops all blood flow to the circle, so the brain is not getting any perfusion whatsoever. So just going to head back to, go ahead, question. Yeah, diathermic syncope. Yeah. Yeah, there's a researcher in Israel at the Bar-Ilan University, Ari Zivitovsky, who's quite famous in the Shechita world. He's written a paper who basically showing that that's halachically impermissible. And I'm not when it comes to halacha, I'll let the crowd be the authority, but I'm not the authority on that. What I will say, though, is that we found 10 articles that were written in German that we had professionally translated, and I'd like to share just a few highlights from them, and then I'll conclude. So here's a paper from 1920. The question was, after Shechita, what happens to perfusion, pressure in the vertebral arteries? So someone in 1920 asked that exact same question. And this is a paper by Professor Lieben, probably a Jew, and he showed that in the vertebral artery, so you see the bottom curve, right after Shechita, where that star is, the pressure drops instantaneously. This was done in 1920. Here's another paper. Can the vertebral artery blood flow explain or account for any reflexive reactions that occur? So let's say you see an animal being slaughtered, and they're kicking and now, to an untrained observer, that might look like the animal is still conscious. And so the question he asked was, can you is the kicking that we see because of blood flow from the vertebral artery. And what he did was he tied off the vertebral artery, right? He did surgery, closed the vertebral artery. You don't need it. Remember, there's 50% perfusion from both ends, so the animal still got up and was completely normal with carotid flow only. And then he slaughtered the animal. And guess what? There were still reflexes there. So he proved, sorry, this is 1927, written in German. He proved that the reflexes have nothing to do with the vertebral artery. Just going to skip here. What does vertebral blood flow rather than pressure? The first paper I showed you looked at pressure. This guy, Salstead, he looked at blood flow. And what he showed was that he put a measuring catheter into the vertebral artery of the animal. They did Shechita, then they looked at the flow. And guess what? They found the flow is 1/5 or 1/6 of total blood supply to that organ, which, if you look at the last line, is 1/30th to 1/40th. So we're talking about, very, very, very 2-3%. This is studies done in the 1920s, and so our modern day calculations show 1%, they're showing 3-4%. It's very similar, very consistent. Probably not statistically different. This is another paper, 1950, from Professor Dukes. If you know who Dukes is, he's essentially in the human medicine. We have Gray's anatomy. In the veterinary medicine, they have Dukes' physiology of domestic animals. He's their Gray anatomy. And he also did a study on Shechita. And here, he again looked at blood flow, blood pressure, and flow in the vertebral arteries. And he concluded, again, that within 2 seconds, blood pressure was less than 1/3 of the normal in the vertebral artery. They conclude that this was below the level of consciousness. This is in the 1950s. And then here's a paper which I love. It's written by Spori in 1965. This is also in German. It was translated into English. And what he did was he looked at pressure in the head of the animal versus the leg, did Shechita, and found that the pressure in the head completely plummets within 1 second of the Shechita. But the reason I love this study so much is because he also included something called a spirogram, where he looked at the rate, the way that the breathing happens. And if you look at the literature, one of the signs that an animal is brain dead is that their breathing becomes irregular. Now, what he showed was the onset of irregular breathing, that little squiggly line, correlates with the drop in pressure of the Shechita. So as a matter of fact, even though we spoke a lot about loss of consciousness, this is some evidence that there is brainstem death that starts to occur from the moment that Shechita is performed. So our conclusions: loss of consciousness happens certainly within 10 seconds. That means it probably, and I choose my words very carefully here, it probably happens before that. We can measure this as quickly as somewhere between 5, 8, 7 seconds, depending on. But again, every test has a sensitivity and a specificity, right? Just because we probably don't have the tools to find the exact second that loss of consciousness occurs. So it's probably before when these slow wave patterns appear on the EEG, which would put it even less. So it's certainly, though, within 10 seconds, and the best modern studies are consistent with experimental data that are over 100 years old. Thank you.